Hey everyone, Ben here. Just with a little request that if you are enjoying the podcast, go to your local podcast app, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Amazon Prime, and make sure to give us some stars. 5 is great, but whatever you think it deserves, and that really helps to put us on the map. Also, feel free to go over to patreon.com/theliminauts and pitch in with a monthly $5 donation if you want to support the project and help me get off my butt and interview other people. So without further ado, here's the podcast. Welcome to the Liminauts podcast. Interviews with individuals testing the liminal spaces between disciplines, perspectives, and practices, with a focus on Buddhism, spirituality, science, philosophy, and wellness from a left perspective. I'm your host, Ben Hawes. My guest today is Hyang Padma. Dr. Hyang is an interfaith chaplain at Tufts, Northeastern, and Brandeis Universities, a spiritual teacher, and a comparative religion scholar and practitioner. She has a doctorate in transpersonal psychology and offers spiritual counseling, Reiki, and astrology readings in private practice. She is also the author of 2 books, Living the Season, Zen Practice for Transformative Times, and Field of Blessings, Ritual and Consciousness in the Work of Buddhist Healers. We talk about the challenges of monasticism in America and what Buddhist meditation has to do with health, intuition, and subtle energy. Without further ado, here's our conversation. So, Hyang, welcome to my little podcast here, the Liminauts. So let's start. I lived underneath your tutelage and leadership at the Cambridge Zen Center in the late 90s, and at the time you were a monastic in the Kwan Um School of Zen, and if you could just kind of tell me about your journey from that time, or even just your journey into Zen and then into whatever it is, all the different things that you're doing now, because it's the focus of the podcast is really people who are bridging different realms or different ideologies or practices. And you've wandered, you have one thread that's wandered through many of these different paths, or I guess many different practices along the way. And so I kind of want to hear about that. And, yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I ordained as a nun in 2003, 1993, in Korea. That seems like ages ago, doesn't it? That's like before many of the students I work with were born.
Yep.
So at that time, right, we can remember that the AIDS crisis had been going on. It was like the pandemic of that time, and it felt very urgent. And since I had been working at the acupuncture clinic that Jane Dobish, Zen master, had founded or helped to found, that had been it had felt very close to me. And I was personally moved by that to really dedicate my life to the practice so that I could help people to find a place of peace and healing from the inside out.
Was that AIDS Care Project?
That was AIDS Care Project.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I did a turn there too during my acupuncture practice. My training.
Right.
Yeah.
So you remember exactly how that was. And so that's really, I think, that was a big catalyst, for my path at that time. And I did the intensive retreat.
Were you enrolled at NISA at that time, or were you just you were just doing volunteer work?
No, I was the office manager.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't sure since you
So
have this healing practice. I didn't know if you'd ever passed through acupuncture school or not.
I always feel like acupuncture school was the path not taken,
Hmm.
right? I've been so close to it in so many ways. I've worked a couple times at both at AIDS Care Project and then later at an acupuncture school in Berkeley. And my research, includes 5-element theory.
Hmm.
So maybe in a past life I
Yeah.
was an acupuncturist. But in this lifetime, what it was really was a catalyst for my meditation practice.
Hmm.
Um, and when I sat my first Kilche, I had dreams that were very influenced by all of those experiences at the clinic, having a chance to integrate. I had dreams about like seroconverting to be like HIV positive from a needle
Mm.
stick, and um, that dreams about the people, and sometimes that was really hard to sit with. But what I really felt was, I guess, a powerful way of working with that was to transform that, to let that make my vow of compassion go deeper. Recognizing that suffering is real and that life is impermanent, and that we're here to brighten the corner of the world where we are. Like, what would I do? And for me, what was the most direct path was to dedicate myself to practice as a nun and to offer that practice to others. I began doing volunteer work teaching meditation at the AIDS Care Project after that, and offering meditation at the Cambridge Zen Center and other places. And out of that, right, just naturally, I had this direction of being of service to my college community. I thought it's so wonderful that I encountered the meditation path when I was in school at Wellesley. Maybe I could start a sitting group there. So I met with the person who was the new dean of religious life. They had just moved to this model of an interfaith chaplaincy in which all the different traditions were represented and worked together as a team to support the college community. And I went in there, and actually it was I don't know, I think in Tibetan language the word is tendril. There's this auspicious connection that happens. So out of that, not only I found a space to offer practice, but I found a job and, in fact, a career as a Buddhist chaplain. And I worked 14 years in all at Wellesley College, and then I went on to get a doctorate in transpersonal psychology, and I taught comparative religions at a graduate program in San Diego County, and then we just ran into the next pandemic, right? That of COVID. And at that time, I went and I did a year of service at the UCSF medical hospital. So the UCSF has a big hospital. It's like a 400-bed hospital at Mount Parnassus in the downtown San Francisco. So I spent a year on the inside of that hospital learning how to do hospital ministry. And that was also very beautiful and very catalytic. But also a little bit exhausting, and one does feel existentially saturated after a bit. So I decided to move back into college chaplaincy, and I'm now at Tufts and Northeastern, and then soon to be Brandeis. But over the summer, I offer my care at Omega Institute, which is this really magical place in the Hudson River Valley that is offering holistic learning programs. So that's kind of, how things have unfolded. I think that I was moved through my own practice at the AIDS Care Project and also working with just my own body to focus on Buddhist healing practices, because I think that aspect of Buddhism is often unacknowledged. That from the beginning, Buddha had encouraged the monks to take care of each other. He said, whoever tends the sick tends me. And a lot of the early monks who brought Buddhism to other countries, for instance, the Korean monk who brought a form of Buddhism to Japan, they were healers, and that's what opened the door. That they came into places where people were a bit stuck. Maybe the king's daughter was sick, or maybe, like for instance, the great Nagarjuna, who was one of these founders of the Mahayana tradition. Like, he was also an Ayurvedic doctor, and he actually had a special gift for compounding these substances that were otherwise poisonous so that they could be ingested and that people could receive a health benefit from them. So there's many stories about that, the people who were teaching the Dharma and also offering healing. And that place of like applied practice is a place that feels very real for me.
Is the desire to practice healing, was that one of the turning points or impetuses for you to give back your nun's precepts?
I think not exactly. Although I felt a bit of restlessness and definitely wanting to apply my practice somehow more directly in the world. I was already entered into a graduate program in counseling psychology, and I was pursuing that as a way of engaging with the practice in a way that's beneficial. Many of the teachers in the Kwan Um Zen school are also doing counseling psychology. So I thought, that's a good fit. You talk to people and help them to solve their issues. But I think the primary motivation was feeling that being in Zen Center administration is not necessarily a shortcut to enlightenment.
Yeah. I mean, that's often I hear that people enter on the monastic path thinking that they're going to get all this time to practice, and then they end up, being professional managerial class for nonprofits. Basically, you end up being a nonprofit administrator. It's really interesting. Do you think, the West, it's particularly challenging to be a monastic, and I would be interested to hear what your thoughts are of the particular challenges of trying to be a monastic in the West, or either just in the United States, since that's your background.
Well, I think
if you feel it is particularly hard, because it's certainly has not grown as fast as lay practice, and seems to be kind of stalling out at a pretty low level. We don't have these big vibrant monasteries.
No, I think definitely in the West that paradigm has not really taken hold in our culture. And so there's a lot of aspects. I mean, for me, one also the additional challenge is like being just about like the only female monastic, right, in our school in North America. And so that's really untenable because, the monastics are all trying to keep things like very simple, right? And like having, a woman in the equation might complicate things. It's not impossible, but it just does mean that there's a little bit less of that kind of basic close connection that one would experience in a Korean monastic setting, where there'd be no shortage of other nuns to hang out with. But generally, I think in the West, there isn't that system for dana, right, for monastic support, or also what that in almost intangible thing that in Korean language is called jung, which is like human warmth. That within Korea, there's this sense where the whole village is taking care of the monastic and making sure that their needs are met. When I was in Korea on retreat and I ran into health issues, the temple knew right away where there were acupuncturists that were friends of the temple, and they treated me at no charge.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that, I was able to continue my practice. And then from that experience, I had a sense of gratitude and went on to do the research highlighting this lineage of Buddhist healing. But in the West, it's quite different. Like I can have all the love for my community, but at the end of the day, I still need to be able to pay the rent on my apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I was living at the Zen Center, I was paying full rent there, which is not the kind of the usual monastic arrangement.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it was the most difficulties of lay life combined with the difficulties of monastic life.
Yeah.
And at some point, one does look around and say, maybe this isn't the most skillful route, especially in ministering to college students who have very kind of pragmatic, everyday concerns. Having 400 precepts isn't really necessary in order to be able to hold space for those kind of questions. And in fact, you could say that just being able to wear everyday clothing, and meet the students where they are as another human being was the most important thing. So that was, I think, that was a large part of the impetus for me to make the changes in the way that I relate to my meditation practice, but also it became clear to me that I was kind of like wired for a more intuitive path. When I was on a Korean Kyolche in 2004, on Mount Kaerongsan, I experienced
the 90-day retreats.
The 90-day retreats.
Was that at Shinwonsa or?
That was at Musangsa.
Musangsa. Okay, the new one.
Yeah, the new one. Relatively new. So I was on that retreat, and about the 75 or 80 days into it, I just did one of these walks around the mountain that one does on the break time. And I visited a shamanic temple on that mountain. A few days later, I began to have these surges of electricity up my spine. And I really had no idea what that was. And also, Daebangsan, my teacher, gave me some advice and said this is, the kind of energy up or mountain sickness. But it was, we didn't really have a good solution for that. And it was absolutely interfering with my meditation practice. It was disruptive. And so I had to work with that in a way that was outside of our Zen structure.
What could you just say? What is the concept of mountain sickness or energy up?
What I actually found that correlated to was what's known as Kundalini rising. So
because we talked about this with my one of my previous guests, Bob Cole, who is a Zen teacher who now works a lot with Kundalini energy in this practice called self-unwinding. So, and it's something that I've also personally had lots of struggles with, but it's also been it's shown me so many things, but it's also one of these things that we don't talk about formally so much. It's this sort of behind the scenes things that people talk about, but I think it's much more common, and we don't, at least in our Western tradition, it's not at the forefront of us talking about it. So I'd love to hear you talk about this. So please go on. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So that was life-changing for me. That's when the electricity was surging through my nervous system from the bottoms of my feet to the top of my head, like as if one had, put a finger into a electric socket. At that point, it's like I acknowledge on a different level that energy is real. That there's no choice but to acknowledge it, because it was very tangibly powerful. I was able to, after that retreat, just maybe take it easy and ground things. But maybe a year later, I had that direction to sit a solo retreat, because in the Kwan Um Zen school, that's what one does as a rite of passage. And we all have that direction towards achieving a rite of passage that will be personally meaningful. And for me, that was just what was calling me. So I found time and I found resources and arranged for this studio out in Wellfleet on the off season. It was a perfect arrangement. Absolutely. Except that maybe 10 days into the retreat, this Kundalini started again. And in order to ground it, because at this point I knew, I definitely need to ground this, because it's just going to help. I was doing 3,000 full prostrations a day just to keep up with it. That's not actually so easy to do.
No, that takes time.
That takes time. It's actually hard on the knees. I have an old knee injury, so that was it was a bit difficult. And even so, there were 3 times in a row when I went on to turn on the light as it got dark, and the bulb would blow. One looks at this in a rational way and says it's not the socket because this is a different lamp than the previous one. It's not the bulb because I've replaced it. It's not like the only consistent factor in this equation is me. So
you're the only constant variable.
I'm the only constant variable. So that's where I began to have a big question, and to say, maybe the paradigm that I'm working with through Zen is not actually enough in the situation. So then I found someone who was energy sensitive, who was able to help me through her shamanic practice to ground that, so that I didn't have that energy breaking through in such a disruptive way. I kind of maintain a good connection to it, but it isn't destabilizing my meditation, and it isn't interfering with my life. So this was actually profoundly helpful. And this also made me curious about the ways of working with that subtle energy that could channel it as a force for good. So one of the things that I began to practice as a way of helping that energy channel to be open and clear and supportive was Reiki. Because through Reiki, one works with that central energy channel and lets the Reiki energy flow through that channel to support the healing of others, so that the other person's biofield basically takes the Reiki and does whatever it's needed to do with it. That basic paradigm it's similar to the research that's been done with acupuncture and the biofield paradigm. The understanding that the body has its own homeostasis, and that if we nudge the biofield in just the right way, then it will heal itself. So that Reiki, the power for Reiki, actually comes from the work that this master of Sweden did when he was doing a retreat on the mountain, Mount Karama, a sacred mountain in Japan. He had his own energy download during his retreat, and the Reiki symbols are passed from one person to another using the traditional Tendai symbols. The symbol for the seed syllable hum that's the kind of core Reiki symbol, and the symbol that one uses for emotional healing is connected to the seed syllable Hri, which is Hri is the seed syllable for Avalokitesvaha, the Bodhisattva of compassion, and also for the medicine Buddha and for Tara. Yeah. So that's, of course that would be healing. That's pure great love and compassion.
Um, you know, in the Kwan Um school, but it's actually maybe more present in the Kwan Um school, because in Korea they haven't completely banished the sort of unsightly shamanic stuff from Zen like they've done a better job of in Japan, but still,
Mm.
Sort of mainstream Zen practice, even in our school, there's understanding of, behind the scenes of this energy of Kundalini, of, and it's not even not traditional for Buddhism, because, you're supposed to get different kinds of wild powers when you practice for a long time. It's like one of the signs. And like in Tibetan
Yeah.
Buddhism, it's quite formal, it's like, oh yeah, you do this practice and, you can run for 400 miles and without stopping. You do this practice and you can keep warm in a cold cave. You do this practice
Yeah.
and you can communicate with your students telepathically, so they don't have to come up the mountain, and, but,
Yeah.
that's sort of become, it's become much more, either frowned upon or folk tradition. Why do you think? Why do you think that is? And especially
Well,
now,
it's
where even
definitely
even where
because,
Daisatsu, Zen Master Sung San, experienced these things and talked about them, especially just with his students, and taught things to his students. But why aren't we having these, uh, you know, energy Kundalini workshops for when, you start shaking uncontrollably? And, it's because
yeah.
I stopped formal practice for 20 years because nobody had an answer for what was going on. And I didn't want to, start shouting and shaking during a retreat. And so there really wasn't anything formal for me to pursue to work on that. So why do you think that is?
Um, well, I think there's a couple things. One of which is um, that although Zen Master Sung San, very clearly brought that in, that was part of his path. That was an important part of his path. He got enlightenment doing 100-day keto. Keto means energy path. It literally means energy path. And in our Zen tradition, if we look actually within the Dharma Mirror, which is the manual of practice forms within the Kwan Um Zen school, there are, for instance, the instructions for doing a keto. At the end of a day of chanting retreat, everyone is supposed to gather in a circle. One person stands in the middle and receives the energy from the other people chanting and begins to allow themselves to move with that universal energy. There's a reason that Zen Master Sung San included that, because it teaches us something about how the self is interdependent with other things, and it's not based on our idea. But that actual exact practice is used as part of the Korean Mudang initiation. As part of the Mudang's initiation, there's a great ceremony that involves a lot of percussion and chanting. And the Mudang stands with her hands palm to palm and waits for the energy to move her spontaneously.
And what is
That's a sign
who is
that
the Mudang?
the Mudang is the Korean shaman.
Okay.
So that is the rite of passage for Korean Mudang. It's interesting that Zen Master Sung San integrated that, and it's really says something about the way that Korean Buddhism and Korean shamanism have grown up in the same room, on the same mountain like siblings. But when Zen Master Sung San brought the practice here to the West, everyone has already got this acculturated idea about Japanese Zen and what does Zen look like. And that story, one of the stories that shows up in Dropping Ashes on the Buddha, right, is plastic flowers, plastic mind. His students are expecting a Japanese aesthetic. They want everything to be tidy. And then these Korean people come in and they put plastic flowers on the altar. The students are immediately dismayed and hide the flowers. This is terrible. And then the Korean people immediately go and get out the flowers and put them right back on the altar. You can imagine that happening. That's a real story. And so then the student goes to Zen Master Sung San because they're upset. This is not fitting their image of what Zen should be. And he says, the flowers are not plastic. It's your mind that is plastic. Your mind has separated into plastic flowers and real flowers, but Buddha doesn't actually care if the flowers are plastic. He only cares about their mind. So keep a mind like the vast ocean, which lets everything go into it. But that's it's really hard to 100% attain that. And so what happened that from my perception is that his Western students continued to look for ways in which the Zen could be contained into a tidy framework that fits our Western epistemology and Western cultural paradigms.
I mean, do you think it's because doing Zen is already weird enough, and then if you have, people, shaking around in the middle of the circle, it's going to be a bit too much to explain to other people. It's sort of, it's going to break propriety, and so it's unseemly more than anything else. We're kind of embarrassed,
That's right.
embarrassed by it, which, in a sense, I mean, what else are we embarrassed by on the path, right? Because then it's like, okay, then we have defined what your enlightenment looks like. We have defined what your practice looks like. We have defined what that you have to only be a certain way. Which, of course, every single Zen story breaks that, right? Every single Zen story is about Zen masters taking that idea that the students want their Zen a very specific way, and turning it upside down, breaking it open. And yet we do those koans every day. We tell those stories every day, and still we bleach the whole thing.
We do. And I think that's part of what in America is our white supremacy culture, like trying to control and manage what we can't actually control. Right? If one of our Western Zen masters, right, a student came to them and said, I had this experience where I did a solo retreat and I saw these beings side by side with me, practicing with me. That's the story. That's the enlightenment story of Zen Master Sung San. Would they say that's beautiful, or would they say that's an issue?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just lifting that up. And it's not just the Kwan Um Zen school, because we see that within Buddhism in the West quite a bit, that we try to fit it within those conventional Western frameworks and epistemologies. And are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater by trying to get something that is culturally congruent for us? I think that's a lot of the issues that people have come back into with regard to mindfulness. They say, John Kabat-Zinn created this so that basically meditation would fit into this Western medical culture. But now that when we look at that, we can see that, it's been stripped maybe. So often the way that mindfulness is taught, it's been stripped of ethics and values and accountability to a community and culture. So in that same way, we have to take a really good look at the way that Buddhism is emerging in the West and create space for its full expression.
Do you think some of that has to do with the legacy of the 60s and 70s of sort of the explosion of cults and charismatic cults and all sorts of crazy practices that, or what seemed like crazy practices, right? And a kind of backlash against the messiness of all of that?
Certainly there is that. All of these Zen Master Sung San's senior students who were hippies back in the day are very respectable now, and looking for a Zen that can fit into the boardroom or into our kind of day-to-day suburban life. I do think that is it. I think that's part of it. And then also, just from a basic framework, unless we allow ourselves to be really exposed to the fullness of Buddhist culture and changed by that, through immersing ourselves in the experience in Korea, and traveling around and seeing the fullness of that, we will tend to see Buddhism through the same lens that we see everything else.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing changes, then nothing changes.
I mean, I think for a lot of us, when we enter, a Buddhist path in the West, you have most people, especially Zen or Tibetan Buddhism, tends to be middle class, well educated folks, right?
Right.
And so or people who are running from other religions, right? Christianity, for example, and where they maybe did not want to accept dogma, and so we face numerous questions about how much of the content of the teachings that we read about or we hear about that cannot be perceived in ordinary states of consciousness. It's the pantheon of bodhisattvas and nagas and all the other types of creatures that are described in various sutras that inhabit the Buddhist pantheon, or whether it's reincarnation, whether these are to be interpreted as real or metaphorical, right? And whether real or metaphor itself is an empty distinction is upaya, right? Skillful means, or whether that actually matters. And are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay. Lost your video. So, because it puts us in conflict with cultural consensus in science. So it's like the first thing is like, okay, is this a cult? Is my mind going to be controlled? Am I going to be told things that are going to go against my judgment? Am I going to be fooled? And so there's a certain amount of suspension of disbelief that you feel like you may be required to have. And so I think, what you're talking about, where contemporary mindfulness culture has been completely sterilized of anything that's not just ordinary consciousness, right? And so, which of course brings up the question, like, can mindfulness where the upper limit of what you can achieve is bounded by discursive reasoning, can that actually engage in non-duality? Because non-duality breaks logic, right? You can have, two things that are, completely coterminous with each other, completely present at the same time, without annihilating each other, interfering with each other. Not one, not two. This idea of not me, not you, not both, not neither, and not just as a metaphor, right? And not just as a phenomenology, but that's not real. That's just a nice experience, but actually understanding that as the ground of reality. So, what do you think? So what do you think of, like, the kind of app-based mindfulness and, the Buddhism of propriety? Like, are we doing more harm than good at this point? Because mindfulness, calling this mindfulness a way to awaken, it seems like all you're awakening to is just more of the same, right? But just quieter.
Right. The fact that Amazon set up little mindfulness huts, within its structures, that does suggest that in some level the mindfulness movement has been co-opted. I'm not saying it's entirely, entirely wrong, but I think everyone, including John Kabat-Zinn at this point, recognizes there are issues in the way that's been implemented. I think, though, the benefit is that we can still source from, the fullness of consciousness, by going back to the source and renewing our connection to Qigong, or to Sun Yu, or to these other practices like Reiki, that work with consciousness, and recognize consciousness as a causal factor. That's the reality of consciousness studies in the West right now. Is there is interest, and very often it's been implemented through researching shamanic pathways and looking at the effect, for instance, that drumming has upon the mind. The way that the brain waves get synchronized from the limbic system all the way through the prefrontal cortex, so that the discursive mind becomes pretty quiet. but the creative part of the prefrontal cortex is still very vibrantly active. There's research on that because that door has been open, but we could do the same research actually within Buddhism and say, here are ways in which these chanting practices that it's like this, the wild part of our Korean Buddhist heritage. It's like, here's ways in which those can really function to help us to open to a wider frame of vision. Stan Grove, who started his life as one of those researchers that discovered LSD, went on to develop holotropic breathwork as a way of safely bringing people into non-ordinary states of consciousness without the use of psychedelics. But actually, keto chanting is another very beautiful way to move into non-ordinary states of consciousness. And it's parallel to what shamans have been doing across centuries. Our own Buddhist tradition is wide enough and deep enough to really give us a more nuanced understanding of what is possible in the realm of consciousness and healing. But there just hasn't been as much research. There needs to be more research done to explore that as a potentiality.
I mean, do you think there's just this leftover Enlightenment era fear of, the superstitious peasant rising again and, ruining everything, whether it's witch burning or, believing in all kinds of things. And we want this orderly, rational society where everything can be explained, where science is venerated, and where everything can be explained by the most ordinary state of consciousness. Your most neurotic state of consciousness is sufficient for understanding reality. The most closed. And I mean, it's interesting to me that we had this opening in the 60s and 70s. There's actually a book called How the Hippies Saved Physics, about these physicists who got really interested in telepathy and psi, and all of these like Gansfeld studies, and we're trying to understand quantum physics through that. And through that, revived this pretty much overlooked physicist, John Bell, who came up with non-locality and that became the basis of modern cryptography. And so, if this entire branch of physics now that just won the Nobel Prize, looking at non-locality, that was all because of these physicists who are really interested in what quantum physics had to say about the real world. But now it's gone back. You look at any, Nova episode, or you look at any mainstream physics discussion, they're like, oh yeah, all those, that there's nothing to it. Quantum physics has nothing to do with the real world. It powers everything. It's underneath everything, but it has nothing to do with our consciousness. Normal thinking is correct. There's nothing interesting or weird. Reality is very mundane. But then we also have all these studies that are actually quite rigorous, that are peer reviewed over many, many years, showing like better than statistical, just 50-50 statistical probability that, people can, anticipate what other people are thinking, and can even anticipate things that are about to happen that haven't happened yet, and will react to them. And these are very rigorous studies. And also in acupuncture too, we've had incredibly rigorous studies showing objective measures, compared to placebo. Well done Harvard study that a friend of mine was headed, done at Mass General Hospital, proved acupuncture. Beyond a doubt, it was super rigorous. Still doesn't change the Wikipedia page, which says it's pseudoscience that has never been validated by a single study. So, so it just seems like there is some kind of huge resistance to this kind of Kundalini energy breaking through. What do you think that's all about?
Yeah, well, what it's really all about is that we all have in our cultural history right? That we have the suppression, of the herbalist and the people who practiced consciousness studies back in the day, who were labeled as witches, who had their own sovereignty, a sort of spiritual sovereignty. And the same, some of the same people who led the kind of scientific enlightenment were involved in the witch trials. That if we look at the language that was used, the language used was that we're going to bind nature and pry her and force her to reveal her secrets. I think that there's this cultural piece that is surfacing, in which we actually need to break through to the next paradigm, and maybe we're right on the edge of it. Right? There was a time when Calvin, was the Calvin degrees were named after. That the physicists said, we've basically discovered all that there is to discover. We're just doing the finishing touches in physics now. We'll be finished in a decade or something. And of course, then it wasn't finished. Then Einstein and quantum physicists broke that wide open. So we have to also ask, what is it that we're not being rigorously empirical about right now? Because that's where the next discoveries will come from.
And it certainly seems that the locus of the resistance is actually around human beings who study physics and study science, right? Because the idea, all of science is predicated on that the observer doesn't really matter, that you can be anybody, it's the data, and that anything is completely reproducible by anybody, that it's interchangeable, that we're all interchangeable cogs. But it certainly seems like if we don't understand what consciousness is, and that we don't understand what the awareness is that is observing all of these studies, right? That is interpreting all of these, that is experiencing time and constructing time, right? And right. and where there's so many things that physics still seems to be agnostic to, like the direction of time, or whether time exists at all, and everything is just essentially a static 4-dimensional block universe, right? So everything is happening simultaneously all at once, forever, in both directions, and is just there. It's like the mind of God. So physics, you can look at that, but then you talk to physicists, and they're like, "Oh yeah, well that's all meaningless." And it's
right.
At least in public. At least in public,
considered. Right. Yeah, consciousness should probably be considered another one of those building blocks, along with space-time. But it takes a lot to make that shift. I think maybe we're on the verge of a shift. But when we do cross that, then suddenly it will seem like, of course. Of course, people have been doing this kind of energy work for centuries. Of course, we've known about qi, since a couple millennia ago. But we just need maybe the next, right? Maybe when psychedelics become more widely practiced, because there's such a good adjunct to PTSD, because that door to research is opening up, because they are able to help the brain to move into this place that it rewires, a place that other medications or therapies have not been so effective in utilizing. Maybe that's the way that the door will open for this next generation. But I definitely feel that this paradigm shift in the area of consciousness and healing is an idea whose time has come.
I think we can maybe seg into actual practices and zooming in on some of the nitty-gritty of the stuff that you're interested in doing. But I kind of wanted to preface it with a fun story. So it's about 2004 or 2005. I was living in Mancos, Colorado, town of about 1,000 people, on a highway 45 minutes west of Durango and close to Mesa Verde National Park. And I went out to get some ice cream for a pie my wife was making, and about 10-minute drive. And as I was getting close to the store on street leading up to the highway, who did I see but you walking down the street? Yes. I have to say this because it's still, I mean, it seems like a dream, you know. And you were there in the middle of nowhere. I had no idea that you were there. You didn't know that we were there. And if I had gone 5 minutes earlier or later, I would have missed you entirely. And so we brought you over, and you had some pie. So what do you think of synchronicities? What do you think they signify, especially for practitioners? Because it certainly seems like it's part of the whole idea of the Tao, that, you know, there's this groove you get into and stuff seems to line up in weird ways. What do you think that is?
So Carl Jung, right, who coined the term synchronicity, had a correspondence with Wolfgang Pauli, the quantum physicist, where they talked about things like this. And Jung had a theory that basically named unus mundus, which is to say that perhaps consciousness and matter are one world. They're two aspects of one reality. And that is also, I feel, a view that you can square with a kind of neo-Whiteheadian approach to say that there's one kind of thing in the universe, but it has two aspects. Mm-hmm. And so if matter and consciousness are two aspects of one thing, which we refer to as substance, then it makes sense that out of the way that my consciousness is tapping into the universal energy, because you and I already have a connection, you know, it's like our consciousnesses, radio waves, you know, are in sync with each other. And so that becomes more likely than it otherwise would be. In Tibetan Buddhism, that concept is known as tendril. And tendril refers to the cause and effect, which is widely known throughout Buddhism as paticca samuppada, the law of cause and effect. It's very straightforward. Because of this, that arises. But the tendril implies that there's a more subtle level on that cause and effect than we can ever know. Mm. So in Korean Buddhism, anytime that you go to a Korean temple, they would refer to it as in-young. And the idea of in-young is that even if you're in the same room with someone, what has really made that connection possible is a couple other dozen lifetimes in which you've brushed shoulders on the street. Mm. There's actually a movie out right now by a Korean filmmaker that goes into this in a beautiful way. It's just the whole movie is themed on in-young. And so what if that's true? Because you and I had already been practicing together and, you know, sort of had that formative Cambridge Zen Center experience together. Then as I'm driving across country, right, this whole big country, you know, it's like I happen to find that one needle in the haystack, you know, the odds of which are like the needle falling from heaven and piercing a mustard seed on earth.
36-hour straight drive from Boston, 3,000 miles on a very minor highway. You know, it wasn't like you were, you know, along a major route. It was a town that no one's been to. Really. I mean, it is along the highway, but you weren't, you know, I mean, it's like running into, you know, in Alaska in, you know, a frontier town, you know, and, or, you know, just randomly someplace, you know, on a cruise in, you know, Antarctica. I mean, would have been as probable, really.
I think that your listeners should bear in mind that this happened in the days before we had GPS on our phones to navigate,
Right.
too. So I was actually just driving across country with a copy of Lonely Planet USA.
Mm.
And that's it. I at some point earlier in that day, I had turned the page and seen that there was a place in Mancos or Durango that could work, to stop over and get a pause from the road. And because I had been driving so much, the thought arose to stretch my legs. And instead of actually parking in front of a restaurant, to walk to the restaurant, which is something that in that town practically nobody does. I didn't see anyone else on the sidewalk anyway.
Yeah, not in the evening, but yeah, I mean, it was, it might have even been a weekday evening. Yeah, there's absolutely no reason for you to be there at that moment and me to be driving by at that moment. And I wonder too, simply because, you and I have also had this, this energy practice realization, in our own lives. I studied with John Meyerson, who I've had on, and studied shamanic practices under him, which really tuned me into energy stuff and my own intuition. But I would say that even my introduction to Buddhism was incredibly synchronistic. I was struggling my freshman year of college and was kind of had hit bottom. I wasn't enamored with being alive anymore and didn't know what to do with myself, and went to an outdoor party and saw someone who I knew that I had some people there who had gone to a school I'd gone to for a couple of years, like a private day school in Cambridge. And I knew there were a few folks from there, and I saw one, and I went up to him and started talking, and we talked for a while, and then we started, for whatever reason, the topic of Buddhism came up. Okay. First, I should say I was talking to him, and I was like, so Matt, so yeah, what have you been doing since I last saw you? How are you? And he's like, oh, my name's not Matt. It's Mike. I'm like, what? You're not, Matt so-and-so. He's like, oh no. It's like, you didn't go to, to this school, to BB&N with me. He's like, oh no, I went to the school next door, Shady Side. It's like, what? And so not only was he not the person who I thought he was, but he was same first letter of the name, not Matt, but Mike, went to the school right next to mine. And, and so, and so it was very weird. And so then we started talking about things, and in the contest of, and I was like, well, why were you talking to me? He's like, I just wanted to see where this was going. And that's when Buddhism came up, because he had done too much psychedelics in high school and got into meditation, Taoist and Zen meditation, to put his mind back together. And so that kind of set off something in my mind, and I immediately went and started reading everything I could. And so that was my introduction, was that very strange experience of seeing somebody who is like some weird parallel version of some other person I knew, who was just close enough that conversation would have, he was exactly the right person to make that mistake with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That wouldn't happen to me because I'm such an introvert. Like the party wouldn't have been the setting for me to have that causal connection. But for me, what happened was I had a roommate who was practicing Aikido when I was in college. And so I started practicing Aikido, and I was practicing with Mitsunari Kanai. Kanai Sensei was one of the students of Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido. He was from a samurai family, and he really had just one of these unmistakably powerful connections to the mystery of ki. He could throw people across the room with barely having touched them. And so I was fascinated by the Aikido. And out of that, I just wanted to improve my reflexes. Most of the people who are very good at Aikido practice meditation as well.
Mm-hmm.
So as I had an Aikido test coming up, I started going to the Zen Center to practice. And the meditation practice helped my Aikido. I would like leave the Aikido dojo 5 minutes early so I could change my clothes and get on to the red line in time for Cambridge Zen Center's chanting. And so when I was sitting meditation, I was still sweating from the Aikido, actually. And so the meditation really did help my Aikido, and it was a great test. And then that night after the test, I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking, that wasn't what it was about, was it? What was that about, that Zen stuff? Like, that's not why I'm doing that. So I went to the Zen Center the next morning for morning practice for the first time. And then, my priorities shifted. I still love Aikido, but because of I tore ACL, the Aikido's not in my life, but I continue to practice Qigong. I've benefited from the work of Robert Peng, who does Buddhist medical Qigong, who's actually teaching here at Omega Campus right now. So that's helped me to keep my finger on the pulse of things. And it's very different than if I had started Zen just with intellectual understanding or studying sutras.
Right on. I think one of the other things I want to talk to you, because I know you've also been into divination as well. So on like the synchronicity end of things. What's your relationship with it, and what do you think, as a tool, or what perspective should meditators have with tools of divination, whether it be tarot or the I Ching or working with astrology? And I'm specifically thinking not just in terms of, is it real or not real, right? And getting back into that, but more in the sense of what are the benefits of having an idea of what's going on versus just letting things be exactly as they are. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of things I'll say about that. One of which is that I feel that a good Buddhist understanding of how these things fit in can be achieved through looking at things like the Yoga Achara school or the Lankavatara Sutra. Basically, in the Heart Sutra, we say that all phenomena are empty. In the Diamond Sutra, we say we should view all phenomena as if they have never appeared, as impermanent and insubstantial as the dream fabric of the night. But in the Lankavatara Sutra, it says you should view all phenomena as if they were like projections of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's the small m mind, which is our personal, consciousness with, like maybe a few things bumping around in it. And then there's the big M mind, which is the place of unus mundus, the one world where consciousness and matter are connecting. One really interesting model for understanding that place of connection, we can actually explore, and it connects both with quantum physics and Buddhism. So I think that you'll enjoy this. So David Bohm had this model, right? He said on the one hand, David Bohm, the physicist, he said there's this explicate order. The tree, the rock, the creek, the stones, the human being, they're all phenomena. That's something we can know and touch, but this explicate order arises from an implicate order, which is pure energy that we can't see and can't touch. But we know it's there, through the inference or through the experience of a few individuals who have tapped into that. And in Buddhism, we would call that world of phenomena Nirmanakaya.
Mm-hmm.
And in Buddhism, we would call the implicate order Dharmakaya, which is that ultimate Buddha nature. But then in between those, right, there is the Sambhogakaya, which is the dream body. And within Bohm's phrasing, he calls that the super implicate order. He says the super implicate order is always corresponding in between that vast sky realm of the ultimate and the blood and bone level of the relative. And it corresponds through images and metaphors and synchronicity. So, for instance, the chemist Kikl, when he was looking at the benzene molecule and trying to discern its structure, he had a dream about Ouroboros, a snake swallowing its own tail. And out of that, he understood that the benzene molecule is a hexagram, not a hexagram,
a hexagon.
Pentagon, I think. Hexagon, yeah.
Hexagon.
So it's that benzene shape came to him through the dream. And so when he received the Nobel Prize, he said, "I thank my dreams." Mm-hmm. So we have these different ways in which we are corresponding with that ultimate level. We know that through the imaginal realm, just as healers and shamanic practitioners have throughout time. And within an everyday life level, we're not all going to have a clairvoyance. I certainly don't. Mm-hmm. But we can work with divination, with the I Ching, with astrology, as ways of tapping into that deeper knowing. When we do work with something like tarot, the cards are going to reflect our own consciousness. So we have to be very mindful. If we pick up the cards with like a victim mindset or the defeatist attitude, everything is like terrible, or I'm just so angry, the cards are just going to reflect that back. They're going to mirror that back.
Mm-hmm. So, like a Rorschach test. I mean, a rationalist might say that they are a Rorschach test,
Right. But also, right, from the level of everything being created by mind, in the same way that you and I somehow managed to find each other across the wide open highway of the United States, it is likely that if you have that, like a stuck place of mind, and you enter into that open space of the cards, what you'll draw to you, what will be reflected back at you, just as it is continuously reflected back at you. Whatever you get from the cards will be a reflection of your own consciousness. So when we go into working with the cards, it should be with a kind of beginner's mind, right? Like a wide open to everything, curious, but without an agenda. Mm-hmm. Astrology, on the other hand, has a framework, right, that was devised like before time. So when one looks at astrology, if we look at it with a kind of good understanding of systems, what astrology is doing is showing us something about the cycles and seasons of nature and time, of which we are also a part, because we are also nature. Mm-hmm. We just have this work to get out of our own way so that grace of nature can come through. So the astrology can be extremely useful for showing us something about the nature of time. Just as if we were taking a tree, if we want to see whether the summer previous was wet or dry, we could examine the tree ring and know that. But the tree ring did not cause that summer to be wet or dry. It's just simply reflecting those conditions.
Right.
So in the same way, I would say the stars and planets don't cause certain things in our life to happen, but they reflect something about the nature of the time, the cycles and seasons of which we've signed on to, that we're effectively a part of.
They're correlative, not causative. Yeah.
Yes. And that information can be very good to have. It's very good for planning, and it's also good for especially good for looking at our early life conditions and the way that those early life conditions contributed to certain archetypal patterns that we might be holding to some degree. If it's showing us something, I would say it's especially good at showing us the samskaras, these kind of patterns with which we came into the world and with which we are constantly alchemizing and hopefully recreating our life.
I mean, I sometimes like it just so I can look at people and say, oh, okay, I have a problem with this person, not because they're doing everything wrong, but because they have a particular style that just is abrasive to me. And I can say, okay, that's because they're this sign, I'm this sign. It's in a way too, for me, it's like, just gives me, and this like in a sense, birth charts or whatever. It can be kind of just sort of, pop astrology or whatever, but it's nice to think that, everybody just has a particular flavor and you're not going to get along easily with everybody. It doesn't mean that they're going about things all wrong,
No, no. I think in Tibetan Buddhism, what they will use the birth chart for is to say what kind of medicine essentially does a person have.
Right.
As you do in traditional Chinese medicine. If someone has a sort of preponderance of fire, right, they might be a very effective speaker, but they're not the person that you're going to want to have creating a spiritual community, because that much fire could be an issue in that situation. Or on the other hand, if someone has a lot of water and a lot of earth, but not that much fire, right, they might be very effective in providing grounding and stability and emotional intelligence and counseling. And it just might not be, their chemistry to be out there in the world as the public face of the organization. At the Zen Center, it was helpful because I could say, here's someone who has a lot of Virgo in their chart. They're very precise. They're meticulous. They have this direction of service. And for them, the love is in the details. And if I sit down and we look at the details together, this will be good for both of us. Whereas if someone else is coming in and they're a Sagittarius, they don't want to do details. They don't do windows. If I try to sit down and do details with a Sagittarius, they are going to have a moment, because the theme song of Sagittarius is don't fence me in. And so from that perspective, like being in the Zen Center and working with many people, I immediately saw that this was an effective way of getting to connect with people in a way that was bringing forth something that was productive for both of us.
I do remember at one point there was we had one senior student who was quite upset at all the astrology and feng shui going on at Cambridge Zen Center. So, do you find that your students now that you are working with as a chaplain are maybe less hyper-focused on the sort of more logical, positivist kind of view of meditation as a way of clearing mind and seeing everything hyper-rationally, which it was a kind of style of Zen practice, right? Do you think, have the students changed at all from, 20 years ago?
I would say on different campuses, the students have a little bit different temperament,
for sure.
Different disposition. But one of my former Wellesley students, she graduated 10 years ago now. She and I had this conversation. She said, I didn't even know until I graduated that you do astrology. But she said, like nowadays, Gen Z, it's like astrology is really hot. You should come out of the closet with that. Let people know what you're doing. So that's what I'm working on now. I do think that the atmosphere has changed.
It has, I mean, here in Colorado, psilocybin was completely decriminalized statewide, and we are formulating a plan to create like a licensed therapy center system here, so people can apply for licenses to do therapies. And then if that goes well, there's room in the law for then just bringing in just by the regulators themselves in Colorado, all the other psychedelic plants. And so, things have really shifted in regards to working with other realms of consciousness, which is also interesting because there's never been a higher preponderance of people meditating to optimize their logical minds. Right, to become effective money makers. In other words, there's never been so many people using so many apps to not only not interrogate their attachments, but to fulfill the wishes of their attachments. And so it's an interesting time. I mean, in a sense, meditation is almost diverging and going in a different direction from this other stream of psychedelic medicine. And I know you are working with your students at Tufts on altered states of consciousness. What are you doing with them?
Well, there's many students at Tufts and Northeastern who have interest in consciousness studies, broadly speaking. One of the things that the students actually chose to do on their own was to take out, to make appointments at one of these float tanks, a sensory deprivation tank, as a way of exploring the nature of consciousness. And I got involved a bit because they wanted me to give them a Dharma talk in preparation. And I thought to myself, this is one occasion for which I've never written a Dharma talk before. Like, I don't even know what kind of talk you would give because I've never been in a float tank myself. So I had to go first and try it out. And then I was able to kind of compose something. And it's really like, right? It's like being in a dark bathtub, but it does change the perception of one's body.
And it
kind
of disappears.
I think, right, it kind of does disappear. And so from that place, right, if you're just resting in the nature of mind, recognize that whatever is arising in the mind is just one of these phenomena. It's like the clouds coming and going. If you recognize that, then everything that appears is just the mind's luminosity, like waves upon the ocean. And from that perspective, it's, I think, really good practice.
Well, I guess the final question I've got for you is going back to working with Kundalini or Sambhogakaya realm issues of the subtle body and energy and things that arise during practice. What kinds of resources would you recommend for practitioners that are working with this and maybe it's coming up and they don't know much about it?
Well, I mean, back in the day, there was something called the Spiritual Emergence Network, which the abbreviation for which is SEN. And that Spiritual Emergence Network was designed by Christina Grof, Stan Grof's wife at the time, as a way of creating a resource for people, who did have these out of the ordinary experiences and just didn't know what to do with it. So I think that the Spiritual Emergence Network still exists in some form. So that's one resource. Another good resource is for people who have those experiences specifically through a kind of psychedelic opening. There is the Zendo Project. And the Zendo Project came out of MAPS, folks who do
we just had a big conference
psychedelic
here.
Research. So, right. So MAPS realizes that not every experience people have with psychedelics is exactly easy or positive. And so the Zendo Project is designed to help people to be familiar with that and train them really to be sitters.
Okay.
There are parameters around which people should have those experiences. There should be a safe container. The set and setting is going to determine the outcome. And so the person who's sitting can help to create a good set and setting. Then I think when we look at it just from the point of view of such experiences spontaneously emerging, it's really good to have someone who is working or familiar with some of the non-ordinary states and the sort of extended map of consciousness. It doesn't have to be exactly the matching map to what we have. One I think very good resource is Daniel Four, who does ancestral medicine. Daniel Four he's great for being a grounded mystic, being able to work with these non-ordinary realms, but then also saying you need to have a good sense of safety, with regard to this exploration. You need to be able to ground yourself and, be clear on your parameters of what you will or will not engage with in the non-ordinary reality, just as you would in the ordinary reality. And so he has a network of practitioners who are available as as counselors, to help people to unravel what might be up for them. And there are also people like myself who do spiritual counseling in a way that is very comprehensive and can help people, train people to work with whatever's arising. Then there's all kinds of situations in which I refer out, depending on the basis of people's concerns and what's arising for them.
Wonderful. Well, I'll put all those in the show notes. Is the ancestral person? How do you spell his last name?
Foor.
Foor.
Daniel Foor.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll find a link for him, and I'll put that in the show notes, and then we'll get a link for you too. Well, that's all I've got. Thank you so much. Wonderful to reconnect with you, and thanks for coming on.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
The spiral keeps on swirling and bringing us back into contact. So at these really interesting moments, and I can't wait to see what happens the next time.
Yeah, right. May we continue to cross paths so auspiciously. I really appreciate you, Ben.
You too. Thank you so much, Jihan.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. You can find plugs and links in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this, you can feel free to contribute to the Patreon at patreon.com/theliminauts. Till next time.